Hello and welcome to the Connecting Africa Digital Week, brought to you in association with the 20th anniversary of AfricaCom, the biggest gathering of tech and telecommunications enthusiasts on the African continent. It's taking place in Cape Town between the 7th and the 9th of November at the CTICC. In this Digital Week webinar, we're taking a look at FinTech, Bitcoin, and the future of banking in Africa. And we're very pleased to be joined today by Lorien Gamaroff, founder and CEO of Bankymoon. As South Africa's foremost blockchain expert, Lorien has been invited around the world to speak on digital currencies and distributed ledgers and their benefits for emerging economies. He has addressed the IMF, the World Bank, FBI, the Commonwealth Secretariat, and the South African Reserve Bank, as well as presenting on TEDx. He offers insight and guidance to business executives and advises governments on blockchain technologies and their implications. He is founder and CEO of Bankymoon, a blockchain and cryptocurrency consultancy, and co-founder and CEO of SendBee, a cryptocurrency payments and remittance company. He co-founded the Blockchain Academy, which educates professionals on all aspects of blockchains from regulation to software development. Thank you so much for joining us today, Lorien. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Amy. It's a pleasure to be here. All right, so thank you everyone for attending this webcast. What I would like to do is give you a unique insight into Bitcoin and blockchain and how it's impacting Africa as a whole. So what I want to do is take you through some context, give you some ideas, tell you what the state of the financial system is on a global context, and also what the impact is going to be going forward. So in October 2015, this remarkable article came out on The Economist, and it spoke about this technology that they said was going to be the most important invention since the internet. And so, of course, many corporates and governments and business people took note because this idea of a decentralized currency that didn't require a central bank or an authority to govern and issue it is a completely strange concept, considering where we've been in terms of money. And there's been no end to all the hype that's been going around the technology that underpins it, the blockchain, with quotes like from the World Economic Forum saying it's going to become the beating heart of the global financial system, and the Bank of England saying that it's a significant innovation that will have far-reaching implications, and so on and so on, with Goldman Sachs, especially nowadays, having quite a strong opinion on the value of Bitcoin itself and where it's potentially going to go. There's a Bitcoin meme with Bitcoin, the price perhaps going to the moon. And if you weren't convinced at this point, then even old Bill Gates believes that Bitcoin and the blockchain is a technological tour de force. So what I would like to do is I'd like to now take you through the process, what it is, what a blockchain is, and what Bitcoin is, and then I'm going to talk about its context within the global financial system and how it's going to transform financial services going on into the future. So it's not unusual to have something like this. In fact, there have been many people since 2000, researchers and economists who've been trying to fulfill what Milton Friedman predicted when he said in early 2000 that the one thing that's missing on the internet, but that will soon be invented, is a reliable e-cash. And what he meant was not a currency, a digital currency that was controlled by the banking system, but a digital token that could be issued that acted as sound money, much like gold, and acted as cash. So now, since 2002, when he made this prediction, researchers and developers and economists, everybody's been trying to figure this out, and basically there's been very little success since that time, until 2009, when a white paper came out describing Bitcoin. So now, if you want to understand how Bitcoin works, and then what I'd like to do is take you through the financial system as it exists today, where what we have is a bank that basically will hold funds for a person, and that person will then be able to transact. But the person doesn't transact directly with that cash. They actually issue instructions to the bank to make payments. So if we now look at the banking system, if we were to imagine a digital cash like the one that Milton Friedman predicted, essentially it would be the situation where you have this bank, and if somebody now wants to go and transact with a token, what would happen is the bank would go and issue that token and send it to the customer, and the customer would actually be holding that digital token. It wouldn't be sitting now at the bank. And then they would be sending over the token to the merchant. Now, this is not how digital currency works at the moment, and in fact is not how Bitcoin works. Bitcoin works very much like the existing banking system. If you think about a bank at the moment, there is a bank will hold an account or a ledger with accounts and balances. And if somebody now wants to go and transact with that money at the merchant, what they in fact will do is they will now go and send an instruction to the bank to move money across to the merchant's bank account. Let's just bring that up here quickly. So what will happen now is the customer will present a credit card to the merchant, but in fact what's going on in the background is instruction has been sent to the bank, and the bank will then move money to the merchant's account. Now, that is, if you understand that process, then you're 90% of the way to understanding how a Bitcoin transaction works. What we have is we have the same sort of system where we have a ledger with accounts and balances, but in this particular situation, in a blockchain, we don't actually have the central authority or the organization which is holding that account. What happens is we have a number of volunteers around the world who are basically are all going to be hosting an instance of that ledger. And that ledger is now distributed amongst all those participants. And they are all performing exactly the same function as the bank, where they are now processing transactions, and they are checking each other constantly to make sure that there is no manipulation or corruption of that ledger. And this is not just within a particular jurisdiction, but actually what we have now is throughout the world, there are a number of these systems, these volunteers that are all hosting copies of this ledger. And what we have at the moment is, with the system, is something very much like the internet, a globally distributed banking system that is decentralized. There isn't a single person or a government or organization that controls that ledger. Everybody has the visibility on that ledger, and they are all in consensus as to what information is on that ledger. And so now, for the first time in history, we have this global banking system, one that can be accessed by anybody with access to the internet, where they can now move money and hold money and move it around the world effortlessly and simply. And this has enormous implications in terms of how people think about holding wealth and holding value, because, again, there is no such thing as a jurisdiction that this money or your value exists. And now individuals have the ability to move money right across border. The concept of moving money across border in terms of Bitcoin transactions just doesn't make sense. We can now have this global financial system that could easily bring financial inclusivity to many of the world's unbanked. And we know that in Africa, there are 80% of people don't have access to the banking system. So why is it called a blockchain? Well, if you understand, again, going back to the bank ledger system, what we have is every few minutes or so, there are transactions that are being broadcast to this network, and they are being grouped together into what we call a block. And then 10 minutes later, another group of transactions are grouped together into another block, and that block is chained onto the previous block. And this is why we called it a blockchain. So if you understand this much about blockchains and Bitcoin, then you really have a good understanding on what we have here. Now, why is it important that we have this ledger with these numbers on it? Why do we think about this thing as money? And if you were to just look into Bitcoin itself, it actually has very many of the same properties as gold, and that is why pundits and economists right now are calling Bitcoin a digital form of gold. So it's exactly like gold, but it has an extra property being digital and being a much better medium of exchange. Okay, so why is this important, and why is it so relevant to Africa and the world as a whole? And it all comes down to this particular picture. Now, I was in fact born in Zimbabwe, and I remember when the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe started printing these $100 trillion notes, and it became very real to everybody living in Zimbabwe that the money system that we have is fundamentally broken, where if you could have a currency that can just be hyperinflated by the central bank, then it means that people can't really have faith and confidence in that system. This is another picture, $100 billion for 3 eggs. And in fact, what we have today now in Zimbabwe are millions of what are called starving billionaires. And the irony now is that those notes, they are worthless as a legal tender, but they do have value, and that's just from the point of view of a sentimental thing, where we can look at this as a memento of how money destroys nations. So if we look at the supply of currency in Zimbabwe, we can see a very definite curve, and it's almost surprising that during the last days of hyperinflation in Zimbabwe, people didn't look at this sort of chart, and this is the supply of money in Zimbabwe, and since 2000, just prior to, in fact, to 2000, realized that this is happening. Couldn't they have stopped such a thing? Will this ever happen again? Well, the funny thing is that Zimbabwe was only the 56th time in the last 100 years that a currency has hyperinflated. And there's now a 57th country that is hyperinflating its currency, and that is Venezuela. And you can see that the chart looks exactly the same as it did in Zimbabwe. So what I did was, when I viewed these charts, I went to go look at my own country, South Africa, to see what the hyperinflation looks like here, and you can't tell the difference. South Africa's money supply is also hyperinflating. So the first thing we wonder is what textbooks these economists or these reserve bankers are reading, because clearly this has only one outcome, and that is destruction of the financial system itself. If you now go look around the world, you'll see China, the chart looks almost exactly the same since 2008. China's been going through hyperinflation. And then finally, the world reserve currency, the US dollar. And it all started in 2008. And when we look at this and we wonder what was the event that had happened in 2008, we all know that was what was called the global financial crisis, where through all the subprime loans that were given out to people who shouldn't have had them, all the banks went insolvent, and so the central bank had to bail out the banking system. And they did that by printing vast amounts of money. And this process is still going on today, with the inevitable outcome of destruction of the global fiat currency system. Fiat meaning that it's a money system that's not backed by any commodity like gold, as it was in 1971. So this is the reality of what's going on right now. People are becoming aware of this. It hasn't been reflected really in consumer price inflation, but we can certainly see how asset prices around the world, specifically the stock markets, global stock markets, have all been rising in response to this inflated supply of money. So we can now look at some countries. If you go look at Venezuela, of course, Venezuela has very high inflation. It's now at just 741%. But there are many countries that are considerably higher than they should be. If we just look at these countries here, these are the top countries right now that are hyperinflating. So we seriously have a problem in terms of the supply of money. That is one of the issues, but there is another issue. When it comes to cross-border remittances, Africa, in fact, has some of the highest costs to move money. If I was in South Africa and I wanted to send money to my neighbors, Botswana, Mozambique, Malawi, I'm going to have to pay 28%. And we can see that from Tanzania to Rwanda, Japan to China, France to China, very, very high costs of remittance. And this is also a big problem right now with the money system we have today, where just moving money from your own country, from the poorest countries on earth, they're having to pay so much. So again, we see a hyperinflation, which has an inevitable consequence of destruction of the currency. We see these very high costs to move money. It's very inconvenient. In fact, in my own country, we often see people moving money across border in suitcases, and it's very insecure and very, very unsafe. And very often the money gets confiscated. So we see these problems, but that's just the sort of tip of the iceberg in terms of a global financial system that just seems to not be able to cater in the same way that the internet and technology has been developing. We have this archaic financial system with great costs and great inconvenience. And there's a number of other issues that we have as well. You might not be aware that there could be such a thing as negative interest rates, but many countries now are, trying to lower their interest rates so much because of very slow-moving economies that we now have this phenomenon of negative interest rates. So if you have money in the bank, you're certainly not going to earn any interest from that. Other issues are the war on cash, the bank bail-ins. We know that some banks now in Europe have legislated bank bail-ins, which means that if the bank starts to if you get into trouble, then what they can do is they can actually take money out of deposited accounts. There's this war on cash, which was most obvious recently in India when they demonetized the high-value notes, and it caused a lot of chaos. People had to now go and exchange notes, and the whole point of this is to drive people into the digital banking system. And this is a very complicated, very difficult thing to do because most people, the digital divide in India is vast, and it's very complicated there. But as banks and central banks would love there to be no physical cash, because if you have digital cash and the only way you can transact is through the banking system, well, then that means every single transaction can have a fee attached, and also every amount, every balance can be controlled. So it really is quite a terrible thing in terms of privacy. And then there's capital controls. We know that countries like China have problems moving money out. We mentioned that there's 80% of Africans unbanked, but many people are unbanked around the world. There's so much geopolitical uncertainty and risk. We see now that North Korea there's threats on North Korea from the US. We see the Middle East has a lot of complications still. It's ongoing. It feels like World War III is around the corner. And then just a general lack of trust in the financial system itself. So there are so many reasons right now to feel very insecure in terms of this financial system as it stands. And in fact, if you go back in history, you realize that financial systems don't last forever. And that particular one we've been on since 1971, since the world went off the gold standard, it is an experiment. And it doesn't seem that those Nobel Prize winning economists that are advising governments and central banks maybe have a hold on what's going on. Now, when it comes to Africa, Africa is an amazing continent because there's the phenomenon of leapfrogging, where people have access to new technology, and specifically mobile devices. And in fact, in my own country and in countries around Southern Africa and Zimbabwe and Mozambique and Botswana, mobile money is so widespread that it's actually there's more money moving to the mobile money system than to the banking system, and because of that, people are very used to the idea of having a digital currency, but one that's not attached to the banking system. Now, if you ever visit one of these countries, you'll probably notice that there are all these QR codes that appear everywhere when you want to make payments for something. There's a well-known company in South Africa called SnapScan, and just about every retailer, every restaurant has this QR code that you can now go and scan with your mobile device, and you can make payments. So mobile money, it's becoming pervasive, and more people are becoming used to it. In fact, we have a lot of people who are self-employed, earn very little money. They on the streets, and they're doing odd jobs here and there. And in fact, they are even signing up to these services. So you could actually now go and if you were to go to a shop, outside there would be somebody who would look after your car, and you can go and scan their little QR code and make microtransaction payments to them. Here's another example of something you'll find on the streets, in South Africa. You can see how people are very used to this idea of mobile money and mobile payments, and so they don't trust the banking system. It's complicated and the fees are onerous. And so now if we were to present something like a Bitcoin technology, it would be, in fact, so easy for them to consider this as a valid form of payments. It's just a natural thing now. And if we look at statistics, we realize that South Africans and other African countries are becoming the countries that are showing most interest. This is just a Google Trends chart which shows interest in Bitcoin, and you can see how Nigeria, Ghana, and South Africa are in the top 5 countries in the world who have the greatest interest in something like Bitcoin. So this is the reality of it. People have lost faith in the system, and in fact don't have access to it in many respects in the first place. And a currency like Bitcoin, it's not that they have to now consider this new idea about what makes something money. It just is a natural thing that they're going to start adopting. And we can see it already in terms of interest in South Africa. South Africa, in fact, has one of the highest volumes of Bitcoin trading and Bitcoin interest. So it's very interesting how this is going to impact the economy. I work with our own reserve bank. We are building products and services around this, helping Africans to access Bitcoin. Our stated goal is to bring Bitcoin to Africa, but right now it is quite complicated. The only way to purchase it is via an online exchange. So what we're trying to do is create very basic products like voucher systems and payment systems which revolve around these cryptocurrencies. And we're very excited about the potential, and so are the people that we interact with. Our own currency in South African Rand has its own volatility, its own issues. And I think what's going to happen is that eventually people are just going to skip the local fiat currencies entirely and move directly into Bitcoin payments, especially since right now Bitcoin, because of its people are appreciating that the value is appreciating and wanting to move their money into it. I think we're going to start seeing a massive wave as these products that make it easy for people to use. You're going to see the growth really happen in Africa. Of course, Bitcoin has its own problems. It's a community-led project with no de facto leader, so it is quite difficult to move it along. And we're starting to see how communities are becoming divided and new versions of the currency are being created. But that's just a healthy thing about the system, where if you want to move it in a certain direction, you have that ability. So we're going to certainly see the free market play a role here in how these technologies develop. And the most amazing thing is that it's decentralized. And so that's where the trust comes in. People don't feel like they need to trust some organization, because trust in organizations and central authorities is thin at best and waning. So this is the exciting time that we have now in Africa, and we're going to start seeing a lot of growth, and there's a lot of potential there. Also, I wanted to just highlight another interesting thing about these currencies, where sure, we could have payments and so on, but what happens when you start talking about a decentralized currency and peer-to-peer payments specifically? You start realizing that a lot of businesses that exist in the world today, essentially what they provide is their value proposition really is as a glorified payment hub. Now, what do I mean by that? If we just look at a very innovative, interesting company that's certainly changing how people travel around, the company Uber, what we have in an Uber situation is we have passengers and drivers. And Uber sure provides an app, but Uber isn't an app. Apps are easy to create. What Uber provides is a trusted way for passengers to be able to make payments to their drivers. And also Uber provides other services like vetting perhaps and insurance and that sort of thing. But if you were to be able to have a payment system that is peer-to-peer, then you don't really need to have a central company to mediate those payments and act as an intermediary. What you could do is you could allow customers, passengers, to directly pay their drivers. And what you could do is you could now disintermediate Uber entirely. Now, of course, you'd still want service providers as satellites who are providing insurance, perhaps, and vetting services and that sort of thing. But you don't really need an Uber. Now, if you think about a lot of businesses, if you think about the sharing economy specifically, like Airbnb, peer-to-peer payments are going to have quite an impact on those business models. And it's not just Airbnb. If you think about marketplaces like eBay, eBay again offers a central place where people can buy and sell, and eBay offers security and trust in terms of payments. But if you can now pay your service providers directly, and you can have these external service providers providing all the features that eBay were providing in terms of vetting the merchants and vetting the customers, again, you don't need to have eBay at all. So what's going to happen now, this is going to be the trend, that businesses what we're going to be seeing is that businesses are going to be providing their services in a direct way, in a peer-to-peer way, because a peer-to-peer payment system takes a lot of the problems that come with accepting credit cards and the chargebacks and frauds that are around that. So we're going to start seeing a lot of decentralized services start being created. And the business models of companies like eBay and even cloud storage and those sorts of services like Google Drive and Dropbox, we now have the ability to mesh and collect unused capacity in terms of storage or CPU or processing power, allow people to Airbnb, if you like, your hard drive, and charge microtransaction, micropayments in a peer-to-peer way. So there's going to be very interesting disruption in terms of a lot of the industry and a lot of the businesses that we take for granted, just because of this ability now to make peer-to-peer payments. And then another use case that is close to my heart, I've been involved in a social project where what we do is we allow foreign donors to make direct payments for energy at needy African schools, where we can now disintermediate the donor organization. And donor organizations act in the same way as intermediaries in other business. They charge fees and also they distribute payments opaquely. And sometimes there's corruption, what we call a leaky bucket. So if you can now pay or donate to that directly to that cause that you believe in, it's very possible to be able to disintermediate actual organizations that take quite a big cut of the payments that are made by donors. And what's nice about that is that you can now reach what's called the long tail of charitable donations. The long tail was popularized by Chris Anderson. He wrote a book called The Long Tail, and he talked about how there are a few number of products or services that have most of the customers. If you think about social networks, there's Facebook, and search engines, there's Google, and the other products that are very popular, and they take most of the market share. And then you have a many number of products or services that have very small market share. Well, that works in the same way for donors, organizations, or at least causes that we believe in. There are very few number of causes out there that eventually have received most of the funding, and there are many, many, many causes out there that receive little to no funding. Well, if you have a peer-to-peer payment system, you can then directly fund those causes you believe in without having to go through an intermediary that then will divert those funds in whatever way they think is important. So this is just a kind of snapshot on how currencies like Bitcoin, these what are called cryptocurrencies, these decentralized currencies, are going to make a big impact on the world in terms of existing business models, but also in terms of how people can actually now pay and earn through peer-to-peer payments, making these microtransactions. A very interesting phenomenon, and also one that we shouldn't disregard. A lot of people will say, well, these cryptocurrencies, there's nothing backing them. But you have to remember that money, there's been all sorts of kinds of money throughout history. There's been seashells and salts and a whole number of things. And, when we look at that, we realize that it's not what money is that makes it money, it's what it does. And again, Bitcoin has all the ingredients for a very good and useful form of money, and that's what makes something valuable. It's usefulness and its scarcity. And we see how Bitcoin has those properties like gold. It's very scarce and it's a good medium of exchange. It's durable, indivisible, and fungible, and so on. And so we certainly are looking at a unique time in history, something that where technology again has surprised us. At first we have our skepticism and doubt about a new technology, but eventually it fills our lives, and we look back and realize, after a few years, how could we live without it? And cryptocurrencies are no different. So anyway, I want to just end now on that. What we have again is we have this unique crowdfunding platform which we are putting together. What we are allowing foreign donors to do is directly fund the energy needs of these little needy African schools and hospitals. We're extending that to be able to now have investors install renewable power supply like solar panels, and then donors can actually go and afford to can donate and fund those renewables, and eventually allow those little schools to become energy independent. But thank you. I'd like to thank you for listening to this. I hope it's inspired you. There's a lot of interesting things around this, and I'm sure that you would find it very fulfilling if you pursue it into the future. Thank you.
Inspiring indeed. Thank you so much, Lorien, for sharing your expert knowledge with us today. And thank you also to all those who tuned in. And if you want to find out more, please check out Lorien's contact details, which could be found at the beginning of this presentation, as well as the description box below. And if you want to continue the discussion, why don't you check out connectingafrica.com for all your latest news and industry developments, as well as at Connect Africa on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And join us in Cape Town on the 20th anniversary of AfricaCom between the 7th and the 9th of November. It's 3 days of content, 400 speakers, and 450 exhibitors over 2 exhibition halls. We're mapping Africa's journey through the 4th Industrial Revolution. So you can even attend the exhibition and a wide selection of talks and presentations for free by signing up for the AfricaCom Visitor Pass. See you again next time for another Digital Week webinar. Thanks. Goodbye. Okay, we're done.